Hello, I'm Alan Hansford with Startup Nuts and Bolts, where we talk about how to move your startup products into the market and strengthen your business. Today I'd like to talk about the 6 simple steps in getting customers to buy your products and services. To get everyone on the same page, let's quickly run down the 6 steps in the buying cycle. Step 1. The buyer must be aware of their need. Step 2. The buyer must be aware of the seller's product. Step 3. The buyer agrees that the product reasonably addresses an essential need. The word essential is important here, and we'll get back to it shortly. Step 4. The buyer agrees that the product is reasonably valued. Step 5. The buyer is willing and able to purchase. And finally, Step 6. The buyer actually consummates the sale. These 6 simple steps describe the vast majority of buying decisions, whether we're talking about an impulse buy in the checkout lane or a major IT development and installation contract. One thing that stands out is the buyer controls if and when they move from one stage to the next, while the seller is responsible for educating the buyer and addressing buyer objections. Some sales transactions can be pretty straightforward, as with the town square vendor selling food to hungry customers during the lunch hour. Yet for many products, the process is much more involved, and especially so for startups just feeling their way while crafting viable value propositions. Let's take a closer look at these 6 steps in the buying cycle to see how they affect mature businesses and startups alike. Step 1. We saw that the seller needs to ensure that the buyer is aware of some need, from simple hunger to a desire for prestige to a hardware or software component required to complete some larger assembly. It might seem obvious that the buyer is aware of their needs, but this is not always the case. You might have seen the many TV commercials educating consumers about mesothelioma. The seller is essentially offering legal services, but the buyer may not initially recognize that they have a need for legal services. If the buyer isn't aware of their own needs, it's very unlikely that they'll commit the effort to pursue your product. Yet it's very common to see startups create products to solve problems that buyers don't recognize or that they don't view as important. In Step 2, we saw that the seller must ensure that the buyer is aware of the seller's product. Here's where advertising, word of mouth, and any number of other promotional activities strive to bring the seller's product to top of mind for buyers. With traditional consumer products, promotional budgets add a substantial amount to the selling price of goods and services. In this age of Web 2.0, many modern companies work to avoid some of this promotional expense by building a more authentic presence, hoping that awareness of their offering will grow virally from non-paid promotions and word-of-mouth efforts. Word-of-mouth programs are much easier to pull off if potential buyers consider their needs or your product worth talking about, which brings us to Step 3. In Step 3, we saw that the buyer must agree that the product reasonably addresses an essential need. This is a 2-part assessment where the buyer believes that the product is effective and the buyer views the need as worthy of addressing. There are really 4 possible buyer responses. Response number 1. Your product does not address my needs. Go directly to jail and do not pass go. Response number 2. I don't know if your product meets my needs or addresses what I need. You have more work to do. Response number 3. I understand my needs and your product. However, your product's effectiveness doesn't matter since I don't consider this need to be important enough to bother with. No deal. Response 4. Your product does address an essential need. Let's talk about moving forward. Only the last of these buyer responses gives a green light to move on to the next step in the process. The first 3 responses indicate that there is more the seller must do to educate the buyer about their needs, about the product, and about the benefits of ownership. Without the buyer's support here, the process can't move on to Step 4. In Step 4, we saw that the buyer must agree that the product is reasonably valued. Aside from the cost to acquire the product, the buyer is often thinking about secondary and hidden costs of ownership. Things like installation expense and time, maintenance costs, the opportunity cost of not pursuing other projects, any number of things. The seller should be taking these same items into consideration as well. But often sellers develop a myopic tunnel vision based on pride in their product. How many times have we heard the story about someone selling a used car? I love this car. This car is great. This car is worth more than the Blue Book. Well, I think as long as it's not our car we're talking about, everyone generally understands that the car is worth exactly what the Blue Book says it's worth. The lesson here is that only the buyer's opinion matters. Whether you're dealing with a car buyer or a high-tech purchasing agent, if the buyer doesn't see adequate value, the deal stalls here. In step 5, we saw that the buyer must be willing and able to purchase the product or service. So let's start with willing. If you've reached this point, your customer believes that they have a need worthy of addressing and that the product is capable of adequately addressing that need at a reasonable price. Yet you need to be careful about jumping to the conclusion that the sale is a go at this point. The buyer may have several worthy and essential needs, each with a viable solution. That doesn't mean that the buyer is willing to pursue all such offers concurrently. With the able aspect of step 5, we run into procedural issues that can derail an otherwise successful sale. This is where budget cycles, available funds, credit, purchase order signing authority, capital committee decisions, and a wide range of other issues can delay or even stop a sale in its tracks. In step 6, we see that the buyer must actually consummate the sale. As with the other steps in the process, the more motivated the buyer is, the more likely they are to follow through with the sale. The seller should not unnecessarily complicate the process at this stage. Some specific suggestions might be to get credit checks, licenses, contracts, and other such administrative impediments out of the way earlier in the process as much as is possible. So to recap, we've talked about the 6 steps in the buying cycle. The buyer controls the pace, while the seller is responsible for educating the buyer and dealing with buyer objections. Rather than skip the steps, you can increase your conversion efficiency by assessing your overall account position early. Don't wait until the end of the buying cycle to discover a weak match. It's too late once your organization has wasted resources on weak accounts. For startups, make sure that your value proposition targets a worthy and essential customer need. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle to gain buyer attention. Thank you for your time. We hope that this information has been helpful, and we welcome your comments or suggestions. Please visit us at www.startupnutsandbolts.com for additional information on other startup topics. We hope to see you there.